A very warm welcome to our fourth lesson. You might remember the Rumi quote at the end of the last lesson. It began like this: I am a servant of the Koran as long as I have a soul. I am dust on the path of Muhammad, the chosen one. So what is this book, the Koran, that Muhammad says he is the servant of? This is the question that will be guiding us in this lesson. But before we look closer at the Quran, I would ask you again to look inside and notice what associations come up if you think about the Quran. What are your assumptions, your ideas, maybe your prejudices about that book? So in the case of non-Muslims, and I'm not going to dwell on this very long this time, it is mostly the images of the media which are negative that shape our understanding of the Quran. And in the case of Muslims, they carry a whole set of ideas and associations taught to them by the societies they grew up in and by the families they were raised in. So yes, the Quran, according to Muslim belief, is the direct word of God, but that doesn't mean that it can't be interpreted, and it doesn't mean it is supposed to be read in a literal way. So here the point is really, how can we get through to the inner meaning of the verses in the Quran? So if you remember from our second lesson, the Quran is one of the articles of faith, of Iman. So having faith in the Quran as the revealed book, as the direct speech of God, is one of the pillars of Iman. Iman, just to recap, translating it as faith, we need to be careful to know that faith, Iman in the Muslim sense, has really nothing to do with the connotations the word faith or the word belief has in English, which somehow puts it close to irrationality or some kind of imagination. But really, Iman is certainty, is a direct knowledge that has to do with being sure, with being certain, rather than with imagination or emotions. So the mu'min, the one who has faith, is someone who is dominated by the intellect and illuminated with the light of God. The intellect here being really that faculty of deeper understanding, of deeper knowledge, and not the shallow mind, which we ordinarily act from and think from. So we said the Quran is the direct word of God, and it is a collection of revelations received by the Prophet over a period of 23 years. You will remember from the last lesson the story of how Muhammad retreated into the cave and he suddenly heard that voice and he didn't know what to do. So this process of revelation started when Muhammad was 40 years old and was completed when he was 63. So we can think of the Prophet as having a sort of mental notebook with blank pages, which were filled with revelations over a period of more than 2 decades. So here is a fundamental difference to, let's say, the New Testament. The New Testament consists of various books written by different people, different authors at different times. So there is a clearly human element to it. This revelation, as we know, did not happen in a linear or chronological way. Sometimes it could take years for one surah, one chapter to be completed. So let's say one verse was revealed at a certain time, and then maybe months or even years later, other verses were added before or after that verse. You can find the Quran sometimes addressing individuals and their challenges and their issues, and sometimes whole communities and whole tribes. And of course, because we are speaking of such a long period, 23 years, you can also imagine that those issues and those topics changed according to the historical development and according to the events in Muhammad's life. So for people, when they take the Quran into their hands, it is first of all very difficult to read. It's not a book that you just read from the first page to the last page, like a nice non-fiction book with a clear structure. No, because the Quran does not have a clear chronological narrative. So a reader of the Quran, first of all, needs to be patient and needs to be very mentally fit to really find his way through the jungle of the surahs, let's say. So it's not something that we can easily grasp with our normally functioning mind. It is much more of an intuitive structure. After the Prophet's death, a whole class of Islamic scholars emerged whose job it was to filter out certain verses according to different topics. So they would come up with all these catalogs. Okay, what does the Quran say about prayer? What does the Quran say about death? What does the Quran say about married life? And so on and so forth. But this is, of course, a man-made structure, man-made efforts to structure the text, whereas the Quran itself, being this intuitive, this direct divine speech, of course, rejects such structure and goes well beyond the rational mind. It is much more of an organic and even mysterious order that we can see in the text. Now let's speak a little bit about the language of the Quran. I already told you in the last lesson when I was speaking about Muhammad's life story that many people converted to Islam because of the beauty of the Arabic verses, the Arab language, which was so eloquent, so harmonious, that when people heard this revelation, they said, this must be true, this must be of divine origin, because no human could have composed something like this. The tone and the language also varies according to the context. So you have stories of the prophets, so there are some historical narratives. You have passages that read like poems, lyrical. For example, when the Quran praises God. And then you have some more, let's say, straightforward prose for legal injunctions, when the Quran treats laws for human beings of how to behave on earth. Before the Quran was written down, it was a book that was recited. The surahs were recited. Muhammad would recite them to the community. They would pass it on. So there was an early oral tradition. And by listening to that recitation, Muslims still nowadays, when they hear the Quran recited, they kind of have their own experience of revelation. So they are trying to emulate, in a way, that initial experience of Muhammad when he was hearing the revelation coming through the voice of Gabriel. And it's as if when you hear the Quran, the text is again being revealed to you in that moment. Of course, with the voice, with the rhythm, with the melody, it has a very profound aesthetic impact on the listener. that in a state of meditation, also new meanings and new discoveries, of course, happen, that can be much more profound than when you actually sit and read the book, on page. So let us just briefly listen to a little example of Quranic recitation to show you really something of the art of reciting the Quran.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. الرحمن الرحيم. مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم. صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين.
So this was the Fatiha, the first surah of the Quran. Fatiha meaning the opening. And the Fatiha is really omnipresent in Islamic life. It's recited at each prayer 5 times a day. And also it is recited at graves to bless the soul of a departed one. It is also recited, of course, by the Sufis very frequently in their prayer meetings. And it really has this function of grounding people in their faith. And the Fatiha begins with the Basmala. Basmala is that formula in the name of God, the all-merciful, the all-compassionate. Bismillah Rahman Rahim. And that formula, let me show it to you. Bismillah Rahman Rahim. So here we have a few frames with calligraphy. Those are blessings on the Prophet Muhammad, and also prayers from the Islamic tradition. And the frame at the very bottom, by the way, these are on one of the walls in the Hagia Sophia. And the frame at the bottom, which has this white background, is the Basmala, Bismillah Rahman Rahim. So I tried to zoom in a little bit. Please forgive the bad quality. But I think it suffices just to show you a little bit of the beauty of the Arabic script. Most of you won't be able to read it, but that's okay. We can just see here these straight lines, which we have a few times. That's the Aleph, the first letter of the Arabic alphabet, which is also a symbol for the human being, standing straight, and shows also the connection between heaven and earth, between up and below, above and below. And the first letter, as you can see, is here the letter called Ba, B, and it has a dot here. So we have a very famous saying in the Islamic tradition by Hazrat Ali, the cousin and son-in-law of Prophet Muhammad, who said that the whole of the Quran is contained in the Fatiha. That's how important the Fatiha is, the opening surah. The whole of the Fatiha is contained in the Basmala, in this sentence, Bismillah Rahman Rahim. The whole of the Basmala is contained in the Ba, in the letter Ba, at the beginning of this formula. And the ba is contained in the dot under the letter. So you see this little dot here at the right-hand corner. This is like the essence of the whole Quran. So, speaking of the content of the Quran, we already mentioned that the Quran addresses different events, different situations, different communities. But if we want to really say what the Quran is about in its essence, it is about the knowledge of God and the ways of guiding people towards God, towards their Creator, and showing them how to worship Him or her. Then we have passages that deal with descriptions of the afterlife, paradise, and hell. And here, the Sufis often emphasized that heaven and hell, they are not so much some imaginary places in the future, but they are really the very conditions of our life here on earth. And there is a beautiful anecdote from the life of Rabia al-Basri, who lived in the city of Basra in Iraq. And she is like this female, this early female mystic in Islam, almost archetypal figure who comes up in all the Sufi writings. And as the anecdote goes, one day she was running through the streets of Basra carrying a pot of water in one hand, a bucket of water in one hand, and a torch in the other hand. When people asked her, "What are you doing?" she said, "I want to put out the fires of hell and burn down the rewards of paradise, because both of them block the way to Allah. I do not want to worship Allah from fear of punishment or for the promise of reward, but I simply want to love Him for the love of Allah." So this is just to give you an example of how Sufis criticized, people's ordinary concepts of paradise and hell, and the reward and punishment mindset that comes with it in Orthodox religion. Then we have parts of the Quran that speak about family matters, how to treat your neighbors, how to do business in a righteous way. We have whole sections with stories that come from the biblical tradition. They already appear in the Bible. And we need to remember here that those stories that appear already in the Bible about prophets actually come from an even older oral tradition that existed within this Abrahamic geography. We even have a surah which is called the Surah Al-Maryam, the Surah of Mary. Mary being a very important character, very important prophet, in fact, of Islam. I also don't want to spare the discussion about the so-called difficult verses of the Quran, because those verses are generally the ones that we hear about most, although of course they are just a handful of verses that are very difficult to read and digest nowadays. They come about as deeply problematic from today's point of view, and those are verses pertaining mainly to gender relations, warfare and the question of how to treat people from other religions. So to understand and read these verses, we need to first of all, as I already said, know the historical backgrounds, the conditions of the revelation, meaning when and why did those verses come up. So there is a linguistic, a social, a moral, and a political context to each of those verses. And when we really try to inspect those verses in that light, we really see that we should not draw any quick conclusions on the basis of just the surface reading. For example, there are verses there is a verse that basically states that men are in charge of women, and then describes how to punish your woman if she doesn't behave. And there is another verse that goes on explaining that you should kill the idol worshippers. So those verses that, of course, come across as violent, again, they have to be understood in the historical context. What really matters is the attitude. If we go and start this journey of discovering a sacred text with the premise of seeing the evil in the tradition, of seeing the evil in the book, then there is no point of reading any further. That's what Omid Safi actually says in his book, Memories of Muhammad. So we really need to try to first of all clear our biases, uncover the historical background, take a close look, and acknowledge that actually all the main faith traditions, as also Gandhi said, which I quoted in the last lesson, all of the faith tradition have these problems. So if you look at the Old Testament, you can also find quite a few verses that when we read them nowadays, you just want to run away because they seem very outdated. They might seem violent even. So understanding the Quran, I think we have understood this by now, requires a receptivity, a curiosity, a mental vitality. So that's why there is a huge tradition of Quran exegesis, and Muhammad actually can be called the first commentator on the Quran. And the hadith, the sayings of the Prophet, are the first commentary on the Quran. When the Prophet's wife Aisha was asked after the Prophet had died, what kind of character did Muhammad have? She is said to have responded, "Have you not read the Quran? His character was the Quran." And actually, the Quran itself in the third surah says, "No one other than God knows its interpretation." There is also hadith that goes like this: "Nobody reaches a true understanding of the Quran if he does not discover many aspects in it." And the word of aspects here is wujuh, which comes from the plural of wajh, which means face. So nobody reaches a true understanding of the Quran if he does not discover many faces, many aspects in it. Rumi makes the same point when he says that it really depends on your own intention. Whatever intention you bring to the text as the reader, that is what you will receive. So you receive in proportion to your own maturity, in proportion to your own receptivity and your own understanding. There are a couple of basic skills which you need to have to approach the Quran in the traditional way. First of all, the ability to read the Arabic script and know the language well enough so you can understand the meaning of the words. And the Arabic which we are talking about here is a sort of high Arabic, which is very different from the Arabic that is spoken on the streets of, let's say, Egypt or Morocco or even Syria, which is a little bit closer to the High Arabic. And we also need to remember that the majority of Muslims in the past and also nowadays were and are non-Arabs. So people that grow up with completely different languages, different language families, and often have to study many years to master the Quranic Arabic. The other skill is the knowledge of tajweed. Tajweed is the science of reciting the Quran in a proper way, with a pleasant melody, the right pronunciation, knowing which sounds need to be stretched, where to put the emphasis, and finding the proper tone. And what is important here is that tajweed, the recitation of the Quran, is not a musical performance. Otherwise, it becomes about the person, the reciter. But what the person, the reciter, the qari of the Quran, really tries to do is to become zero, to disappear in the face of the beauty of this recitation, of this text. And the last skill is the memorization of the Quran, at least a few verses and surahs, which is also necessary to perform the prayers. And someone who has memorized all of the Quran is called a Hafiz. And all Islamic cultures have established training systems for children at a young age to memorize the Quran, which always is something desired in traditional Islamic families, to have one child in the family who is a Hafiz. So, speaking of tajweed, the beautiful way of reciting the Quran, I would like to play for you the beginning of another surah, the Surah Yasin. And my invitation to you is that you close your eyes and just listen for a few moments to this recitation and see what effect it has on you, on your body, on your heart. Is there anything you notice? Is there anything that comes up in you, even if you don't understand the words, just by listening to the recitation?
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ياسين والقرآن الحكيم إنك لمن المرسلين على صراط مستقيم تنزيل العزيز الرحيم لتنذر قوما ما أنذر آباؤهم فهم غافلون لقد حق القول على أكثرهم فهم لا يؤمنون إنا جعلنا في أعناقهم أغلالا فهي إلى الأذقان فهم مقمحون وجعلنا من بين أيديهم سدا ومن خلفهم سدا فأغشيناهم فهم لا يبصرون وسواء عليهم أأنذرتهم أم لم تنذرهم لا يؤمنون إنما تنذر من اتبع الذكر وخشي الرحمن بالغيب فبشره بمغفرة وأجر كريم إنا نحن نحيي الموتى ونكتب ما قدموا وآثارهم وكل شيء أحصيناه في إمام مبين واضرب لهم مثلا أصحاب القرية إذ جاءها المرسلون إذ أرسلنا إليهم اثنين فكذبوهما فعززنا بثالث.
The Quran is not a book of law, as it is often presented actually in the West. The Quran is a source of law, so we can draw a number of laws and a number of rules from the Quran, but that is really not at the focus of the Quran. The legalistic verses of the Quran that pertain to laws, to do's and don'ts, make up only about 4 to 6% of the text. Whereas there are many more verses speaking about prayer life, about human spirituality, about esoteric aspects, parables, and so on. And the great Al-Ghazali, the great medieval Islamic scholar, already was aware of this problem. And he said, those who are so learned about rare forms of divorce can tell you nothing about the simpler things of the spiritual life, such as the meaning of sincerity towards God or trust in Him. So this is like, wanting to split a lentil and discussing all the fine points of what to do when you want to divorce and all those legal issues. But then when it comes down to the real spirituality, to really knowing what is in the heart of the human being, those legal scholars will be clueless. So that's, of course, also a game of the ego. So before we move to the Sufis, just want to wrap it up by giving a few examples of the place of the Quran in Islamic culture in the past and also nowadays. So to sum up, we really need to understand that the Quran cannot be reduced to any particular issue. It is more than the sum of its parts, and it is really a field of meaning, a field of different inspirations. Ingrid Madsen, who I'm drawing on a lot here, a Quranic scholar from the US, she likens the Quran to an anatomy book listing different parts of the body. And just like an anatomy book does not tell us anything about the experience of what it means to be human, a list of topics in the Quran would tell us nothing about what the Quran means to believers. The experience of having the living word of God present in the world. So what is that experience for Muslims? For Muslims, everything about the Quran is sacred. Sufis, for example, they take care to only touch the Quran in the state of ablution. So having done the ritual washing before taking the Quran into their hands. Because as it is said, only the pure ones should touch the Quran. That means not only physical purity, but also being pure inside when you touch the inner meaning of the Quran. There is also a tradition that Muslims, when they set off for a journey, the family members will hold a copy of the Quran over their head, and they will pass under the Quran as a blessing. In fact, the city of Shiraz in central Iran has a gate called the Darvoze Quran, the gateway of the Quran. So when you enter the city, you actually have to pass under the Quran, which is at the top of the gate. The reading of the Quran, as I already said, is practiced on religious holidays, at weddings, at funerals, to bless all the people involved. And it is even consulted at non-religious gatherings, opening, speeches or conferences with a recitation of the Quran to bless the event and remind all the people present of the divine presence, of the divine omnipresence. And specifically during the month of Ramadan, which is the month in which the Quran was first revealed, Muslims intend to read the whole Quran, to finish the whole Quran from beginning to end. And that's why the Quran is broken into 30 parts. So each of the 30 days, you read a certain amount of text. Now, let me show you a few examples of ancient Quranic manuscripts, because those manuscripts really reflect the deep respect and reverence Muslims have for their holy book. This one is one of the earliest manuscripts of the Quran from the 7th century, so probably just after the death of Prophet Muhammad. And then in a much later period, here we have the tradition of Quranic illumination, or the tradition of embellishing the Quran with colors, with patterns, with floral designs, with beautiful calligraphy, which is a whole art form in itself. And the colors that often dominate in these beautiful manuscripts are the colors gold and blue. Gold being the color of illumination, of light, a color that is somewhat otherworldly and shows this connection to the spirit, and the dark and deep blue being a symbol for the heavens, for the universe. Here we have another beautiful example. And this is actually here on the right side is the Fatiha. And then it goes on here with the Surat al-Baqarah, the second surah. And just look at the intricacies, the fine, fine details here. So it will get a little bit pixely, but I think you can imagine what it takes to to illustrate a whole Quran in this way. Here is another example from the 18th century. So many of the verses, as we already said, they don't easily open themselves to you. Some are even intentionally enigmatic. So it is necessary to meditate, to reflect, or also to consult the help of famous commentators. To study who who died in the 9th century, said, if man received 1,000 degrees of understanding for each letter of the Quran, this would not exhaust all the meanings which are contained in just one verse. So all those verses, all those meanings, all those meditations had a profound impact on Islamic spiritual life over the centuries. Because for Sufis, the entire Quran is spirit, is speech which has emanated directly from God. Whether it be the stories of prophets, whether it's about moral precepts, even legal regulations, each verse contains some sort of a secret. And those levels of understanding, so you have the obvious meaning and you have a number of layers below that. So there are different numbers about that. Sometimes the number 7 is mentioned, but even there are Sufis who say that there are many more layers of meaning. Those layers, they correspond to different levels of consciousness. And the Sufi undergoes a long inward process, long inward effort, so that the veils can be lifted from his or her perception, and he can really access the core of this book. There is also something in the Arabic language that makes it particularly fitting to these metaphysical and unseen dimensions. Languages of divine revelations like Arabic, Hebrew, and also Sanskrit have something in common, which is that words are often ambiguous. They can reflect different levels of reality at once, from the concrete meaning to the abstract, to the universal meaning. Those languages are very strong in symbolism. That's why we can call them symbolic languages, as opposed to Western languages, where meaning is often very defined and it's lying bare in front of you, so to say. It's out in the open. But with the Semitic languages, so Arabic and Hebrew are part of the family of Semitic languages, there is something peculiar because we don't write the vowels. So that's why, for example, the word Yahweh in Hebrew, the divine name in the Jewish religion, is written without vowels, and very much the same way with Arabic words. So one word also has the capacity of multiple meanings. And that, of course, makes possible a whole net of different connections between different words and between the roots of those words. And depending on where you put the vowels, one word can have different meanings. And now this is the problem when you translate the Quran, that the translator has to fix the meaning. The translator has to choose a certain meaning. And what has often happened, speaking, for example, about Turkish translations, because those translations were made by men with a certain mindset, the meaning was often is often more on the side of a, let's say, orthodox or patriarchal interpretation, whereas there could be as well different ways to interpret the text. There are a couple of verses in the Quran which always get cited, get quoted again and again by Sufis. We already talked about the importance of the Miraj for Sufis in the last lesson. The Miraj is that heavenly journey of Muhammad, which symbolizes for Sufis the ascension of the human being to God. There are other verses which are almost like mottos of the Sufi path. One of them being the famous verse 50:16, where Allah speaks, "We are closer to him than his jugular vein." So addressing the believer, we are closer to him than his jugular vein. The jugular vein being this life-giving vein, and really as a powerful symbol for the ultimate proximity of God to us. Another verse that is very important for Sufis, and maybe the most mystical verse in the whole Quran, is the verse of light, the Ayatul Nur. And that verse, let me show you a photo of that verse that I took a couple of years ago in the Hagia Sophia. So this is the grand dome of the Hagia Sophia, with a beautiful writing of the light verse around the center. And let me read this verse to you, which is full of metaphors. I won't go into any kind of interpretation. The invitation is maybe just really to stay with this verse and with the images in this verse. God is the light of the heavens and the earth. The parable of his light is, as it were, that of a niche containing a lamp. The lamp is enclosed in a glass, the glass shining like a radiant star. A lamp lit from a blessed tree, an olive tree that is neither of the east nor of the west, the oil whereof is so bright that it would well nigh give light of itself, even though fire had not touched it. Light upon light. God guides unto his light him that he wills to be guided. And to this end God propounds parables unto men, since God alone has full knowledge of all things. In the last part of this lesson, I would like to speak about the term ayah. Ayah meaning both a verse and a sign, and the deeper metaphysics behind this concept and how this applies to Islam's relationship with the natural world. So when the Quran uses the word ayah, it often refers to the world of creation, to nature. And that's why mosques are often embellished not only with Quranic verses or ayat, being the plural of ayah, but also with decorative patterns taken from nature, so floral motifs. And both those kinds of ayah, the signs of the natural world, and also the Quranic verses, they are all reminders of God's beauty. So let me show you a few photos that I took in mosques in different countries. We already saw the light verse in the dome of the Hagia Sophia. So here we have the beauty really of the Islamic calligraphy, and we'll be speaking more about calligraphy in the lesson on Islamic arts and beauty. Let's look at this mosque. This is the famous Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, which I visited in 2009. And here you can see both on the portal of the mosque and also on this structure here in the courtyard of the mosque, beautiful mosaics with depictions of paradise. Here is one of the great mosques of Isfahan. I've taken a photo here of one of the walls, and we can see three sections. First of all, a section with certain designs intertwined, here both flowers and also these yellowish geometric shapes in between. Again, we have the color gold. So it's something like a kind of a gold, contrasting with the deep blue. Also the Quranic script, the calligraphy being written on a dark blue strip. And then at the bottom, we have a very intricate design of floral motifs, which you can also see in Persian carpets. So this is the complete composition. You can imagine it just goes on like that, all the way up to the dome, to the ceiling of the mosque. This is another mosque, Sheikh Lutfallah Mosque in Shiraz, which also uses floral motifs, but in a slightly different way. Here we can clearly see the influence of European architecture and European aesthetics. The Quran often states that God is displaying his signs, continuously displaying his signs in creation. For example, in Surah number 41, we shall show them our signs in the universe and in themselves until they see that it is the truth, God. Now, if you remember from our second lesson, where we talked about the Shahada, that makes, as the central teaching of Islam, makes the distinction between God and everything other than God, between the real and the unreal. So in the Shahada, we can see the world from 2 points of view. The first point of view being nothing is real, only God is real. So all things other than God are unreal. They are like veils in front of God. But the second perspective, the second point of view is that all things are signs of God, and all things in the world, in creation, are manifestations of God, and therefore they are real to some extent. So that is really the journey, again, from the unreal to the real, and from the real back into manifestation, seeing everything as aspects, as manifestations of that real. That's why the Quran says in the second surah, in the Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 115, wherever you turn, there is the face of God. Waj'ullah. Wherever you turn, there is the face of God. Different groups of Sufis always emphasized those two perspectives. Some emphasized more the perspective of transcendence, God being beyond, and others emphasized the aspect of immanence, God really being immanent in all of creation. One of the Sufis who was definitely a follower of the aspect of immanence because he had reached that deep understanding and deep realization and could perceive the one God in everything, in every being, in every creature. One of those mystics was Yunus Emre, the great contemporary of Rumi and Anatolian folk poet who plays a very big role in Turkish Sufism. And he has this beautiful poem, Dağlar ile, Tashlar ile çağırırım Mevlam seni. So let me read two stanzas from that poem. With the mountains, with the stones, I call you, Lord, O Lord. With the birds in early dawn, I call you, Lord, O Lord. With the fishes in the sea, with gazelles in deserts free, with the mystics call, O He, I call you, Lord, O Lord. This is a translation of the great Annemarie Schimmel, the German Sufi scholar. Ibn Arabi has another beautiful quote here where he says, "Glory be unto him who hides himself by that which is none other than he." Okay, this quote needs a little bit of contemplation, so listen well. Glory be unto him who hides himself by that which is none other than he. So this is the great mystery of existence, according to the Sufis, that all of creation veils God by what is none other than God. So it really depends on your perception and your level of maturity. And according to that maturity, created things or creatures can either be veils in front of God, or they can reveal God himself. The divine manifests itself through all of creation, and creation is composed, according to Sufism, of opposites. So it is the interplay of opposites that creates the world, that holds the world together. And those opposites in Islam, they're often exemplified through the 99 names of Allah, the Isma'ul Husna, as they are called. And those 99 names of Allah, they describe various aspects of God. Let me show you an image from a mosque in Akshehir, near Konya. You see those little circles near the ceiling. Those are the 99 names of God. For example, here we have the name Al-Hafiz, being the protector. We have the name, or also the sustainer, I believe, the one who guards. We have the name Al-Hamid. We have the name Al-Hayy, Al-Hayy Al-Qayyum. Al-Hayy is the life-giving one. So some of those names, they are opposite to each other. For example, we have the names Al-Dahir and Al-Batin, the outward and the inward. For the Sufis, the outward is always a manifestation of the inward. And those contrasting names, those opposites, are like the archetypes that exist in all of creation and inside the human being. It says in the Quran that in the beginning, Allah taught all those names, all the names, to Adam. And that knowledge of the names is stored in us from the very beginning. And that's why we are capable of recovering that knowledge. Another important pair of opposites is Jamal and Jalal. Jamal and Jalal. It's kind of the overarching, the archetypal pair of opposites in Islamic philosophy. Jamal is divine beauty, divine mercy, whereas Jalal is divine majesty and divine wrath. You could also say Jamal is gentleness, whereas Jalal is severity. Those are the feminine and the masculine poles, the yin and the yang. And like in the beautiful yin and yang symbol, they are, of course, always existing together. So wherever divine mercy shows itself, there is also an aspect of wrath, of severity inside, and vice versa. Wherever there is divine wrath, there is also mercy. So we could maybe say right now that we are going through a time of wrath, where God is displaying his or her wrath. So if you look at the chaos and all the troubles of the world, that which in Hinduism they call the Kali Yuga, that is an expression of wrath. But of course, it is possible to find the mercy within that wrath. And ultimately, that wrath is also a manifestation of God's mercy. So the Quran invites human beings to read those signs, to find those names, those different manifestations, by contemplating God in creation. So, how do those signs manifest in nature, and how does Islam perceive nature? You might be surprised to hear that the Quran is full of natural elements. It mentions different kinds of trees, the olive tree, the pomegranate tree. Even surahs are named after animals. So there's the Surah Al-Baqarah, the second surah, the surah of the cow. There is also a surah of the bee. There is the surah of the spider. And we have other surahs named after natural elements. So it seems almost like the Quran was not only revealed to human beings, but to all of nature. In Surah number 6, it says, all the creatures on land and all the flying birds have different communities, just as you people do. Nothing is left without a mention in the book. They will all be brought into the presence of their Lord. So all the beasts on land and all the flying birds have their communities, have their own ummah. And it is well established in the hadith that the Prophet loved animals, particularly cats. No wonder why. Myself being a cat lover also. And the hadith, they are full of instructions how to treat animals in a kind way. Yunus Emre has another beautiful verse here. He says, every bee that enters the beehive speaks 1,001 blessings over Muhammad. There is another verse in the Quran, verse number 63 of Surah 25. The servants of the compassionate of God are those who walk upon the earth humbly. And when the foolish address them, they say peace. In fact, the area around the Kaaba, which was, if you remember from Muhammad's life story, that sanctified land, the sanctuary, the sacred surrounding area, where it was forbidden to fight. And it was also forbidden in that area to hunt or cut down trees. So in a way, that zone in Mecca was the very first national park. And also in Islamic law, in Islamic law, it is forbidden to burn trees during a war. To wrap it up, the Sufis say that there are 3 books in which God has written out his signs or her signs. Just always keep in mind that God is genderless. What are those 3 books? The Quran, the Cosmos, and the human soul. Now, hearing the Quran when it is recited is not very difficult. But how can we hear the signs of the other two books, the cosmos, the universe, and the human self, the soul? How can we not be among the ones of which the Quran says in Surah 22, they have hearts, but they do not understand with them, and they have ears, but they do not hear with them. They have hearts, but they do not understand with them, and they have ears, but they do not hear with them. This is a very profound description of the human state, of our habitual slumber, of our slumber of forgetfulness, our antennas not being aligned to God's signs and God's revelation. So for the Sufis to become receptive, the human being needs to undergo a spiritual training process. And that's the process of opening your heart, of removing the obstacles in yourself. And this is what we'll be looking at in the next lessons when we talk about Sufi practice. Today's Rumi poem is a quote from the Masnavi. And as always, I invite you to just listen to the Farsi in the original. حرف قرآن را بدان که ظاهری است، زیر ظاهر باطنی بس قاهری است. زیر آن باطن یکی بطن سوم، که در او گردد خردها جمله گم. بطن چارم اصنبی خود کس ندید، جز خدای بی نظیر بی ندید. تو ز قرآن ای پسر ظاهر مبین، دیو آدم را نبیند جز که طین. ظاهر قرآن چون شخص آدمی است، که نقوشش ظاهر و جانش خفی است. Know that the words of the Quran have an exterior, and under the exterior an interior, exceedingly overpowering, and beneath that inward a third interior, wherein all intellects become lost. The fourth interior of the Quran none has perceived at all, except God, the peerless and incomparable. In the Quran, do not you, O son, regard the exterior. The devil regards Adam as nothing but clay. The exterior of the Quran is like a man's person, for his features are visible, while his spirit is hidden.